My name is Solene, and I was 29 years old the evening my father slid a legal envelope across the dining room table and told me to sign it or lose everything. The envelope contained a document his attorneys had prepared. It was essentially a choice, structured as paperwork, the way my father structures most things he doesn't want to discuss out loud. Sign, and receive a settlement that would sever my claim to any future inheritance in exchange for a lump sum. Don't sign, and be removed from his estate entirely, with no negotiation, no appeal, and no further contact funded by him in any form. He said, "This is not a punishment. It's a business decision. You've made your choice, so I'm making mine." My husband Theo was sitting beside me. He looked at the envelope, then at my father, and said, very quietly, "She doesn't need to sign anything." My father looked at Theo the way he looks at line items he's decided to cut. I pushed the envelope back across the table. We left. What my father did not know, what none of his attorneys had thought to verify, because why would they, given what Theo did for a living, was that the envelope was the least important document in the room that night. 9 months later, I watched my father freeze at his own podium. I'll tell you what stopped him. Welcome back to channel, where quiet people outlast every room they're told they don't belong in. If you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a comment. I read all of them. My father's name is Gerard Ashworth, and he has been, for as long as I can remember, a man who experiences the world primarily as a sequence of decisions to be optimized. This is not a criticism dressed up as a character sketch. It is simply accurate. Gerard Ashworth did not build the Ashworth Hotel Group for properties across 3 cities, a 5th under development, a reputation in the regional hospitality industry for being relentless about finish quality and unforgiving about cost, by experiencing the world sentimentally. He built it by making better calls than the people around him, more consistently over a longer period of time, and by surrounding himself with people who understood that his standards were not a mood but a structure. I am his only child. My mother left when I was 11, not dramatically, not with lawyers and a custody battle, but with a suitcase and a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear, and a forwarding address in Vancouver that she updated twice in the first year, and then stopped updating. My father did not discuss it. He hired a housekeeper named Mrs. Fenn who was competent and warm in a professional way, and he continued building his hotel group, and I continued growing up inside the architecture of his ambition, which was, in its way, a kind of love. It just didn't always feel like it from the inside. I was good at school in the specific way that children of exacting parents often are: methodical, thorough, oriented toward the kind of performance that can be measured and reported. I studied hospitality management, which pleased my father because it was adjacent to his world, and then I took a graduate degree in finance, which pleased him more. By the time I was 26, I was working in the revenue management division of a mid-sized hotel consultancy called Paramount Stays, which had contracts with 11 independent hotel groups across the region, and I was good at it. Good at reading the numbers. Good at identifying the structural inefficiencies that looked like bad luck, but were actually bad decisions made 18 months earlier by people who hadn't run the projections far enough out. My father approved of Paramount Stays. He occasionally sent referrals. He and I had dinner most Sundays, and the dinners were not warm exactly, but they were consistent, and consistency was, in our family, the primary love language. This is the life I was living when I met Theo. I want to tell you about my father's anchor, first, because she matters to what came later. My grandmother on my father's side, his mother, Celeste Ashworth, was 81 years old and lived in a ground-floor apartment in the Elmhurst district, 20 minutes from my father's main office. She had been a bookkeeper for most of her working life, quiet and precise, and she retained in her 80s the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades listening carefully before speaking. My father visited her every other Sunday. I visited her most weeks, often without him. Celeste was the person in my family who asked questions and waited for the actual answer. She was the person who, when I told her about Theo, did not immediately begin the process of categorizing him by income bracket or professional standing. She said, "Tell me what he's like." And I did. And at the end of it she said, "He sounds like someone who pays attention." I said he was. She said that was not a small thing. She was also the person who, 6 months before the grand opening, took my hand across her kitchen table and said, in her direct, unbothered way, "Your father is going to feel very foolish. That's not your fault, and it's not something you need to manage." I didn't ask her how she knew what she knew. With Celeste, you didn't need to. She came to the grand opening incidentally. My father had arranged a car for her. She sat in the third row and watched everything with the expression of someone attending a play she has already read. I met Theo Marchand at a municipal transit authority meeting. This requires explanation. Paramount Stays had a contract with a boutique hotel near the central transit hub, and the hotel's general manager had flagged a recurring issue with guest access. The bus routes serving the hotel's district had been rerouted twice in 18 months, and each rerouting had measurably affected occupancy in specific room categories. My job was to document the impact and prepare a brief for the hotel's ownership ahead of a public comment session on the next proposed rerouting. The Transit Authority held these sessions in a conference room in their administrative building, and they were, in my experience, largely procedural. The decisions had generally been made, and the public comment session was the formal step before implementation. Theo was presenting on behalf of the drivers' union that evening. He was not the union representative. That was a man named Kowalski who spoke first and ran long and used the phrase "at the end of the day" 11 times, which I counted because I was waiting for my slot. Theo presented after Kowalski. He had 3 minutes and a single printed sheet of data, and he used both efficiently. He identified a specific pattern in the proposed rerouting that the authority's traffic modeling had underweight, a shift in off-peak load distribution that would create a compounding delay problem at the eastern transfer point within 8 months of implementation. He cited the numbers.
He sat down.
The authority's traffic planner looked at the sheet for a moment and said, "We'll note this for review." Theo said, "The note is in the record." That's all I needed. After the session, I caught him near the exit and told him his analysis of the eastern transfer point was correct and that the authority's model had the same flaw I'd seen in hotel demand forecasting systems that hadn't been updated to account for behavioral shift post-pandemic. He looked at me with the expression of someone recalibrating their expectation of a conversation and said, "You pulled that from the traffic model they published?" I said I had. He said, "Do you want to get coffee and talk about it?" I said yes. We dated for 16 months before he proposed. By that point, I knew him in the way you know someone when you have paid close attention to them across a significant range of circumstances. I knew how he handled frustration, which was quietly and productively. I knew how he handled other people's bad days, which was with the specific patience of someone who genuinely does not find people's complications inconvenient. I knew that he read widely and remembered what he read and connected things across domains in a way that I recognized, from years of working in revenue analysis, as the signature of someone who understands systems. I also knew, by then, what he had built before he drove buses. He told me on a Sunday evening in the kitchen of his apartment, told me the same way he tells me most things, directly and without performance, as though information is simply information and the right response to it is whatever is actually true. He had spent 8 years before the transit job working in infrastructure finance. He had co-founded a small investment holding group with 2 partners when he was 24. The holding group had a portfolio that had grown over those 8 years to encompass minority stakes in 6 commercial properties across the region. He had stepped back from active management of a holding group when his co-founder's health declined and the operational demands of the portfolio required someone physically present in a way his schedule didn't permit. He had taken the transit job in the interim, genuinely, because he found the systems interesting and the work concrete in a way that desk work often wasn't, and had remained in it because it suited him and because the holding group's management had stabilized. He had not hidden this. He simply had not led with it because it was not, to him, the most interesting thing about himself. I sat with it for a moment. Then I said, "Does my father know?" Theo said, "I don't believe so. I haven't met your father." I said, "You will." He said, "I know." We looked at each other across the kitchen counter. Neither of us said anything else about it. We made dinner and ate it and talked about other things entirely, and I understood, without it needing to be spoken, that we had just agreed on something. My father's response to Theo was not immediate hostility. I want to be accurate about this, because it matters. The first dinner at my father's house was tolerable. My father was courteous in the specific way he is courteous to people he is still assessing. He asked Theo about his work with the Transit Authority, which Theo described without embarrassment or apology. He asked about Theo's background, which Theo answered honestly and without elaboration. My father's expression across those answers was the expression of someone running numbers quietly in his head and finding the sum disappointing, but not yet conclusive. After that dinner, my father called me and said that Theo seemed like a decent man, but that he was concerned about the long-term fit. He doesn't have the orientation, my father said, which is the word he uses when he means ambition structured the way he recognizes it. I said that I thought Theo's orientation was fine. My father said we'd talk more about it. The second dinner was less tolerable. My father had, in the intervening month, done what he always does when he's decided to resolve an assessment. He'd asked around. What he found was accurate as far as it went. Theo drove buses for the Municipal Transit Authority. He had a decent apartment in a mid-priced district. His financial profile, as far as my father's network could determine, was unremarkable. What his network did not find was the holding group, because the holding group was structured in a way that did not surface under the search terms my father's people used. This was not Theo's design. It was simply the difference between looking for a bus driver and looking for an infrastructure investor who also drives buses, and my father's people had been given the former description. After the second dinner, my father said, plainly, "I think you're making a decision based on feeling rather than evidence." I said, "I think the evidence is fine." He said, "I'd like you to consider what you're giving up." I said I had considered it. The third dinner did not happen. Instead, on a Wednesday evening 6 weeks later, my father called and asked me to come to the house alone. I went. Theo offered to come. I said it would be fine and that I would tell him everything when I got back. The envelope was on the dining room table when I arrived. My father did not present it as a threat. I want to be precise about this too, because threat implies a kind of heat that my father does not produce. He presented it the way he presents difficult operational decisions, as a reality that had been arrived at through analysis, that he regretted in the way you regret a necessary cost, but that he had concluded was the right call. He had had his attorneys draft a settlement agreement. It was, he explained, structured to be fair, a lump sum payment in exchange for my formal release of any claim to his estate, his business interests, or his assets in perpetuity. The sum was substantial by most measures. By his measures, it was the capitalized value of what he'd already invested in my education and early career support, formalized and concluded. "This isn't what I wanted," he said. "But you're choosing a path, and I need to protect what I've built. That's not personal. That's stewardship." I hadn't called Theo from the car on the way over, but Theo had called me, and I had put him on speaker without answering, which meant he was listening when I arrived. He heard the first part of the conversation. He asked if he could come in. My father, who did not realize Theo was on the line, paused. Then he said, with the equanimity of someone who has decided the conversation is already concluded, "If you'd like." Theo arrived 12 minutes later. He sat down across from my father. He looked at the envelope. He looked at my father. He said, "She doesn't need to sign anything." My father said, "That's her decision to make." Theo said, "It is." There was a silence in which the three of us occupied the room without anyone moving. My father's hands were flat on the table. Theo's were in his lap. Mine were around a glass of water I hadn't drunk. I picked up the envelope. I looked at it for a moment. I put it back on the table and slid it toward my father. I said, "We're going to go." My father said, "If you leave now, the offer doesn't stay open." I said, "Okay." We left. In the car, I drove the first 4 blocks without saying anything. Then I said, "He doesn't know." Theo said, "I know he doesn't." I said, "Do you want him to?" Theo said, "Not from me." I thought about that. I said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." We went home. I made tea. We sat at the table, and I told him everything my father had said, including the parts Theo hadn't heard from the car. When I finished, Theo said, "Are you all right?" I said I was. He said, "Then we're fine." The 9 months between the envelope and the grand opening were not a waiting period, exactly. Life does not pause itself for pending revelations. We worked. We ate dinner. We made plans, some of them small, and some of them less small, and we executed them at the pace that made sense. My grandmother, Celeste, called me 3 days after the envelope evening. She had heard from my father, which meant she had heard his version. She said, "I hope you know what you're doing." I said, "I thought I did." She said, "Good. Then do it quietly." She paused, and then she said, "Theo's people, the holding group." I asked around. "They have the Meridian Crossing stake." I said yes. She made a sound that, in another person, I would have called satisfaction. She said, "Your father is going to feel very foolish." I said, "That's not what this is about." She said, "I know, but it's what's going to happen." At Paramount Stays, I had been assigned to the revenue assessment for a new independent boutique property in the waterfront district, a smaller project, but complex because the property straddled two zoning classifications and the demand modeling required accounting for both the corporate transient market and the weekend leisure segment simultaneously. I liked the work. I was, during those 9 months, doing some of the best work I'd done at Paramount, possibly because I had stopped spending mental energy on the slow grief of managing my father's expectations. I went to see Celeste most weeks. She was, by that point, moving more slowly and tiring more quickly, but her mind was exactly what it had always been. She asked Theo about the Eastern Transfer Point situation. She had remembered it from when I told her how we met, and Theo sat in her kitchen and explained what had eventually happened at the Transit Authority, and she listened with her full attention and asked 2 follow-up questions that were better than most of the questions the authority's own planners had asked. She said to me afterward, "He thinks before he talks." That's rarer than it should be. My father's 5th property, the one he'd been developing for 3 years, the one he'd reorganized his company structure around, the one he described to his investors as the property that would define Ashworth Hotel Group's next chapter, was the Harlan, a 220-room full-service hotel in the Convention District. The financing for the Harlan had been assembled in stages over 4 years. My father's firm had the operating stake. The real estate investment was structured through a consortium of investors, the largest single stake of which, 34%, making it the majority position, was held by a holding group called Marchand Voss Capital Partners. I had known this since the evening Theo told me about his portfolio, 8 months into our relationship. Marchand was Theo's name. Voss was his co-founder's name. Marchand Voss had taken the Harlan position 14 months before Theo and I met, when the property was still in early-stage financing and my father had needed a capital infusion to close the land acquisition. The deal had been brokered through a commercial real estate intermediary, which meant my father had met the terms of the investment but had never met the investor directly. He knew the holding group by name. He did not know who was behind it. I had not told him, not because I was managing an outcome, because it was Theo's information to share, and Theo had decided not to share it preemptively, and I agreed with that decision, and we had both understood, without discussing it in those terms, that the information would eventually surface in its own time, and that the time was not something we needed to arrange. The grand opening of the Harlan was a significant event. My father had spent considerable effort on it. The guest list was 480 people, including the mayor's chief of staff, 3 city council members, 11 members of the regional business press, and representatives from each of the major investors in the property. The program had been designed by the same PR firm he'd used for 15 years. There would be remarks from a city official, brief comments from the construction consortium lead, and then an investor address, the featured speaker, representing the Harlan's majority stakeholder. The invitation to speak had gone to Marchand Voss Capital Partners 6 weeks before the event. Theo had confirmed attendance 3 weeks before. The program had been finalized and printed 2 weeks before. My father had approved the program. He had read the name Marchand Voss Capital Partners on the program and on every financing document for 4 years. He had not connected it to the man his daughter had married because it had not occurred to him to connect it. Why would it? The man his daughter had married drove buses. We arrived at the Harlan 40 minutes before the program began. The lobby was everything my father had designed it to be: high ceilings, warm stone, the particular quality of light that good hotel designers achieve by spending money in exactly the right places. Staff moved through the room with the precisely calibrated attention of people who have been trained for weeks for this specific morning. The floral arrangements were architectural. The printed programs on the entrance table were heavy cream stock, the Ashworth logo embossed in the upper right corner. Theo picked up a program. He looked at his name on the interior page in the speaker biography section, and his expression did not change in any visible way. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. I looked around the room. My father was near the front, working the room with the efficiency of a man who knows exactly which 20 conversations matter most and is moving through them in order. He was in a dark suit, the one he wears for events he's decided are important. He looked well. He had the expression of a man who has poured 3 years and a significant portion of his capital into something and is allowing himself, for one morning, to feel the satisfaction of completion. He saw me from across the room before I reached him. He went still for a moment, the specific stillness of a man recalibrating his understanding of who is in the room and why. Then he resumed moving and reached us in 2 minutes. He said, "Solene." He looked at Theo. He said, "I wasn't expecting you." Theo said, "I was asked to speak. I confirmed 3 weeks ago." My father said, "You..." And then he stopped. Something moved across his face, not an expression exactly, more a brief passage of competing thoughts resolving into a single conclusion. He looked at Theo.
He looked at me.
His jaw was set. His hands, at his sides, had gone very still. He said, slowly, "Marchand Voss." Theo said, "Yes." My father stood there for a moment. 480 people moved around us. Someone laughed at something near the entrance. A camera crew repositioned near the podium. My father said, "How long?" Theo said, "The Harlan position was taken 14 months before Solene and I met." My father looked at me. His face had the quality of stone that has absorbed cold, rigid, and oddly pale at once, the kind of stillness that comes when a very controlled person encounters information that exceeds their control structures. I looked back at him. I did not say anything. There was nothing I needed to say. The program began on schedule. The city official spoke for 7 minutes. The construction consortium lead spoke for 5. They were both good, both warm toward my father, both appropriate to the occasion. My father stood near the podium with the expression of a man completing a task that has become, in the last 20 minutes, significantly more complicated than it was when the morning began. The event coordinator stepped to the podium and said that she was pleased to introduce the featured speaker representing the Harlan's majority stakeholder, Marchand Voss Capital Partners.
She said his name.
I was watching the room, not my father. I saw the business press row absorb it, 3 journalists leaning slightly in sequence toward their programs, reading the biography line, looking up at Theo as he walked to the podium. I saw 2 of my father's board members exchange a glance. I saw the mayor's chief of staff, who had been introduced to Theo during the pre-program reception and had chatted with him easily for 4 minutes, process the connection between the man he'd been talking to and the name on the program, and arrive at a visible recalibration that he managed with professional composure, but not quite professional speed. I saw Celeste in the 3rd row sit very straight and fold her hands in her lap, and I knew that expression. It was the expression she wears when something she expected to happen has happened. My father was at the podium's left. He had been standing there for the previous 2 speakers. When Theo's name was announced, my father's head turned, not a full turn, just the minimum required to confirm what the coordinator had said, and then he went absolutely still. Not the stillness of composure. The stillness of a man who has just looked down and found the floor several inches lower than he thought it was. Theo walked to the podium and said good morning. He thanked the room. He said that Marchand Voss had been proud to be part of the Harlan's development from the early financing stages, and that properties like this one, full service, convention adjacent, built for the business traveler who expects detail, were exactly the kind of long-term investment his firm looked for. He spoke for 14 minutes. He was specific and credible and generous toward my father's firm in the way that carries weight because it comes from the person holding the majority stake. He cited decisions the Ashworth team had made that had preserved quality under budget pressure. He described the Harlan's market position in the convention district with the precision of someone who has been paying close attention to the numbers for 4 years. The room listened with the particular attention that 480 people give a speaker who has surprised them. My father listened too. His expression for those 14 minutes was the expression of a man doing very fast and very thorough arithmetic. When Theo finished, the applause was long and genuine. The ribbon cutting was at the building's main entrance. Large ceremonial scissors, the mayor's chief of staff, my father, the construction lead, Theo, a photographer. The ribbon parted. People applauded. I was standing 12 feet away with Celeste, who had made her way forward during the repositioning. She put her hand on my arm briefly and said nothing. I put my hand over hers for a moment. That was the entirety of it. My father found me during the reception. He came across the room with the directness of a man who has decided that the conversation cannot be deferred. He stopped in front of me. He looked at Theo, who was speaking with one of the board members, and then he looked at me. He said, "You knew from the beginning." I said, "Not from the beginning. From about 8 months in." He said, "And you didn't." I said, "It wasn't my information to share." He stood there. His hands were in his jacket pockets. He was looking at a point slightly past my left shoulder, which is what he does when he's working through something he hasn't yet organized. Then he looked directly at me and said, "I made a judgment." I said, "You did." He said, "It was wrong." I said, "Yes." Another pause. He said, "I'd like to," and then he stopped, because my father is not a man who finishes that sentence easily. He said, "I would like to correct some things." I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the envelope on the table. I thought about the 3 dinners. I thought about my mother's forwarding address and the way my father had structured for 30 years the particular version of love he was capable of producing. I said, "We're going to be at Celeste's next Sunday. If you want to come." He said, "I'll be there." The weeks after the Harlan opening had the particular texture of things that have been out of alignment settling back into position. My father called 3 days later. Not a long call, he does not make long calls, but a real one. Without the operational substructure he usually builds around difficult conversations. He said that he had been thinking about what Theo had said during the ribbon cutting, specifically about the Harlan's market position, and that he thought there were 1 or 2 points he'd like to discuss if Theo was open to it. I said I'd ask. Theo said he was open to it. That conversation happened at Celeste's on the Sunday I'd mentioned. It was the first time my father and Theo had been in the same room since the envelope evening 9 months earlier. They talked for 2 hours, mostly about the Harlan's first quarter projections and about a development site in the waterfront corridor that Marchand Voss had been evaluating. My father asked questions and listened to the answers. Theo asked questions and listened to the answers. I sat next to Celeste and we drank tea and let it proceed. At one point Celeste said to my father, very quietly, "He thinks before he talks." My father looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression that has been making him uncomfortable since he was 6 years old. He said, "I noticed." She said, "Good." She refilled her tea. The formal reconciliation, if that's the right word, and I'm not sure it is, did not happen in a single conversation. It happened in the way most real things happen. Incrementally, imperfectly, with backsliding and awkward dinners and moments where my father's old instincts surfaced and had to be managed. He did not become a different person. He became, slowly, a version of himself that had updated one significant piece of its data set and was adjusting its outputs accordingly. He has never re-raised the envelope. He has never, to my knowledge, re-raised the question of Theo's standing. What he has done is show up at Celeste's on Sundays and ask Theo questions at dinner and wait for the actual answers, and once, only once, say to me, in the car outside his office after a lunch meeting, "I nearly made a very expensive mistake." I said, "I know." He said, "I appreciate that you didn't." And he didn't finish that sentence either. I said, "You didn't need me to." He said, "No." He got out of the car and went back to work. That was the closest he got. For him, it was a great deal. I think about that envelope sometimes. Not with anger. The anger burned through its useful phase a long time ago, somewhere around month 3 of the 9 months, and what it left behind was something cooler and more useful, a clarity about what I wanted and what I was willing to exchange for it. What I think about is the logic my father used. He looked at Theo and saw absence, Absence of the markers, the indicators, the surface signals that his model told him to look for. And absence of the expected signal read, in his model, as absence of value. It's a clean, functional system. It produces accurate results most of the time, in the domain it was built for. The problem is that it wasn't built for people who have deliberately stepped outside the expected signal pattern. It wasn't built for someone who understood infrastructure finance and chose, for a period, to drive buses because the systems were interesting. It wasn't built for Theo. My father's model was not wrong. It was just incomplete. And the cost of its incompleteness was 9 months and an envelope and a grand opening in front of 480 people that he will be asked about, in various contexts, for the rest of his career. I don't say any of that to him. I don't need to. He has done the arithmetic himself. Theo and I still live in the same apartment, the one with the window that faces the Eastern District. We have dinner at the table most nights. We talk about the things you talk about when you have built something together and you are still building. The holding group is in the process of expanding its regional footprint. I left Paramount Stays last year and now consult independently, which gives me the flexibility the work requires. We are, in the quiet, daily, completely ordinary way that is the only way I know how to measure it, exactly where I thought we'd be. Celeste came for dinner last month. She sat at the table by the window and ate the food Theo made and told us a story about a building she'd worked in 40 years ago that had subsequently fallen down due to a foundation error that 3 separate engineers had missed. The story was funny and precise and took 11 minutes to tell. When she finished, Theo asked her 2 follow-up questions. She answered them with the full attention she gives everything. On her way out, she stopped at the door and said to me, "Your father's trying." I said I knew. She said, "That's enough for now." I said I thought it was. The thing I keep returning to is this. The room at the Harlan did the work. I didn't do it. Theo didn't arrange it. The work of 30 years of patient, careful, undramatic building did it, and all we had to do was walk through the door. That's the only version of this story I know how to tell. No ultimatum returned, no envelope represented, no speech at the podium about who was right and who was wrong. Just a name on a program, and a room full of people updating their understanding, and my father's face in the moment he updated his. That's enough. That's always been enough. That's my story. An envelope, a bus route, and a name on a program. If you had been sitting in that lobby when Theo walked to the podium, and you'd seen my father's face when he heard the introduction, would you have said something to my father afterward, or let the morning speak for itself? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.